to boldly go where no private enterprise has ever gone before.
Welcome to This Week in Common Sense, starring Paul Jacob. This week on thisiscommonsense.org, Paul began by talking about honor and horror, and ended by talking about the horrors in Minneapolis burning. Somewhere in the middle there, he talked about the coronavirus. And I'm wearing a mask, but that's not necessary in the privacy of my own studio. So here we are, the last week of May 2020, and I'm asking Paul, where do we begin?
Where do we go? This is a curveball. Let's go to Dragon into Orbit, which is a commentary about a first. The first time ever, first time in 9 years, that the U.S. has launched men into space, that they have been launched, even if they were Americans, that they were launched from U.S. soil. And so that's something, especially I think in the age of coronavirus, people realize that it may be important at different times that we be able to accomplish things independently. And that maybe if our supply lines all run through, the world's worst totalitarian power, that could be problematic. So anyway, we had a launch, and this is the first launch by a private enterprise operation.
But we didn't have a launch.
Oh, right. Well, small detail, Tim. Small detail. Geez, some people get caught up in the minutia. You're right. The weather, which, you would have thought that the modeling that I'm sure has been done all over the place as to what was going to be going on Wednesday would have said, hey, this won't be a launch. There'll be a lightning strike, maybe at 11:43 a.m., maybe at 11:44. That sort of information, so we wouldn't have gone through all the trouble. But it's set up for Saturday, and if it goes off, I guess I am a little, maybe it was a little ahead of my skis, but if it goes off, then of course it'll be the first time that a private company has handled the launch of astronauts into space. And it's been, as we mentioned in this piece, it's been a long time coming for private companies to be doing it. And I haven't always loved everything Elon Musk has done, although I have liked some of his recent stuff that we wrote about, opening his Tesla company and saying, I have a right to open it, I'm going to do it. And he's in California. So, but I love to see this effort. I love space, the last frontier. And I love, even though I don't fully understand it, I love mankind's inability to stop looking for new things and finding new things, finding new ways to get on the edge of some cliff, finding new ways. I mean, I think back to, ancient times and the first sea travel and so on. And I'm just thinking these guys have to be crazy. But we all do it in our own ways, some more than others. But no doubt it's probably the most important survival trait of the human race is the fact that individual humans will experiment the wisdom of crowds sort of thing, where you have all these people who are looking to do new things, who are, the freer they are, the more they're engaging with the planet. And of course, with Elon Musk, looking to engage with other planets like Mars. And, I don't spend much time worrying about it. Thank goodness. I'm forgetful. But, an asteroid could hit the Earth and we're gone. And there's all kinds of things that could happen. And it would be wonderful to see mankind advance and for free human Homo sapien peoples to be all over the universe would be just wonderful in my book. And so that's a little far afield maybe from just sending somebody to the space station, but America, for defense reasons, needs to have a space program and needs to be doing things in space. And this is way too important to leave to the government. And private enterprise needs to be engaged in it in ways that will, again, bring the wisdom of crowds to the issue. And it's exciting to see. It was the best news of the week. And even though we didn't have the launch, just thinking about it, for me, it was the best news of the week. And if they push it off Saturday, I may be on some ledge somewhere, But because I've already counted the good news. And when it happens, I'll go, I already celebrated. But now I'll celebrate again.
Elon Musk said something kind of interesting this week. He's always saying something interesting these days. Sometimes just absolutely crazy. But this week he said somewhere, I forget the exact words, but he said something like, if the launch goes off, NASA will be praised, all the workers will be praised, the companies that involved, everybody's efforts will receive credit. But if the launch is a failure, I'll receive the blame. And he accepted responsibility, was basically saying that's appropriate, that he needs to accept the blame for that. It's an interesting attitude he had. I'm not sure what that meant, but
it's a great leadership attitude, because it's basically saying my payoff comes from seeing the success. And the most important thing for me to do as a leader when there's success is to spend my time thanking everybody else for it and motivating them for it. Because, you got the time in the shower where you can go, God, I'm a wonderful person. God, I'm great. My mother was right. But anyway, you want to motivate people. And so that's, it's the old credit goes down, blame goes up. Although it seems in government and in industry, one of the problems is bad things that happen in government tend to seep over sometimes into industry and vice versa. And so, anyway, it's I've completely lost my train of thought as to where I was, because I was about to go somewhere else.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this goes. But your other pieces this week were not nearly so hopeful.
No. Really, well, let's start with the worst news of the week, which is a man's dead in Minneapolis, a black man killed by a white policeman behaving badly. And we see arson, looting, riots, protests. Now, protest makes a lot of sense. And, if someone throws something at the police station, especially in this area where there's been, this is an area where two other very well publicized police murders that just made no sense whatsoever. Philando Castile, who was the black man who the guy shot 5-6 times into the car. It's the one people will probably remember because his girlfriend, her kid is in the back seat, and a bullet just barely missed the 4-year-old. He told the policeman, I just want you to know, in very calm, reasonable, tone, I do have a gun. Well, don't get it out. I'm not going to. Well, don't. Boom, 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 boom. It just seemed like it escalated to craziness. And of course, you can't see everything that's happening in the car, but there was never a good argument for, at a certain point, you cannot allow police to say, well, I shot the 7 4th graders because I, heard something pop and I thought one of them had a gun. And I say 4th graders because at a certain point, if the standard is, anytime I make a mistake and blow your head off, if you think it's a somewhat legitimate mistake or could be, it would beyond a reasonable doubt, maybe could have been a mistake. It's okay. We're in trouble. I should turn my phone off, shouldn't I?
Well, that's an old-fashioned ring.
It is. I almost always have my phone off. Drives me crazy. So, but anyway, so where am I with the?
Well, you were talking about the killing in the car, but that's just one example of
Yes,
of
and then
a pattern there in Minnesota.
and then there was the woman who was, I believe she was Australian, if I remember correctly, but a white woman, and she reported what she thought was a rape in behind her house. She heard yelling, and the police came. She went out to, see what was what and to give them any more information she could, and they shot her and killed her. Now, the policeman who shot and killed her was convicted and sentenced to 12 and a half years. Interestingly enough, though, he happened to be Somali American, so a person of color, or a black person, or a Somali person, and she, being Australian, was white. And so, again, you have the racial component. Now, you don't hear all the stories when the racial components match up to where it was a black policeman who happened to kill a black person, or it was a black policeman who killed a white person, or what have you. And you look at the propensities for, your risk, so to speak, of being killed by a policeman. And as I understand it, you have more risk as a white individual than as a black individual. But I know that that's been hotly disputed and so on. The bottom line to all of it, though, is a lot of people want to have a conversation about race. And Lord knows some people could use multiple conversations, hopefully with the right people. And, that's great and wonderful, but it doesn't solve the problem. Unless you really think you can get everyone to sit around a table, it's going to be a really big table. And in other words, why didn't somebody else think of that? And I think from a kind of political revolutionary standpoint, the hardcore people who want change and who see injustice, and some of those people I think are off their rocker. Others of those people are wonderful people who are going to make the world a better place, and hopefully will agree with me more, so that all their efforts are more copacetic. But anyway, some of those people are wonderful people, and it seems to me that the efforts of people to have a conversation have gone to what? To it just keeps happening. The efforts of people to somehow say, well, we have to shake the system, we have to burn down stores, we have to have protests, we have to get more violent, even though this level of violence isn't the level you see in many parts of the world on different things. That hasn't worked at all. I mean, let's look at the track record in Ferguson. I mean, it does get newspaper stories, it gets more TV if things are burning, but it just has no success in terms of changing the criminal justice system, it seems to me. And I want to see focus on things that can actually be changed. And Jay Schweikert with the Cato Institute and with a website called unlawfulshield.com has basically launched a campaign to put the focus on what's called qualified immunity. And qualified immunity, basically the Congress back in the 19th century, when every once in a while, this was 1871, and the Congress did something good. They passed Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Law. And this is a section, for one, that allows when we sue because a state legislature has passed a law that's totally draconian and attempts to silence people through the initiative petition process, we go to federal court. When we win, which we almost always do because almost everything they pass is unconstitutional, as they know it is as they pass it. But as we go to court, it's under that part of the civil rights law, we are then can be given our fees by the judge. Doesn't always happen, but usually does happen. And so it's difficult to raise money to defend people's constitutional rights. It's very helpful when you can get some or all of that money back once you win the case. And of course, unfortunately, these cases often drag on 2 or 3 years or more. But anyway, these are that section of the civil rights law basically says if a government official takes away your freedom, violates the law and your rights, they're liable. And you can take them to court. They can be, arrested for these charges. They don't have some special, hey, I get to punch you in the face because I'm a policeman and you're in my cruiser. That's not part of it. And in essence, what the Supreme Court did in the case was to say there's something called qualified immunity, and that police officers and other public officials have that. And so that somehow their behavior has to be more completely outrageous and unreasonable than, that it has to rise to some new level of something that clearly they knew violated this person's rights, and they had some sort of pre-knowledge that slugging them or doing something else was terrible. But this little aspect of the law appears to be responsible for a tremendous amount of violence against Americans and against people. And so basically changing this all of a sudden flips the script tremendously and means that, if police start getting convicted for violating people's rights, they will violate their rights less. That's the theory. And I submit that creating a dynamic and an incentive for police to behave better, and frankly for other public officials to be more respectful of people's rights because they could be held liable for violating them, is going to create a much kinder, gentler nation. And that will go further to repairing race divides and to stopping policemen of whatever race from killing a black man or a woman of any race, more than all the discussions on TV, more than any looting will ever deliver. And so that was our Friday script, Minneapolis burning. And Minneapolis is a wonderful city. I've spent some time there, and Twin Cities. And St. Paul, can't forget St. Paul.
It seems rather hot to me, by the way. What I took away from Minneapolis was that it was unbearably hot, but I visited in July, so.
Well, I just think that's funny because Minneapolis is probably the coldest place I've ever spent any time. Now, I was only there in the summer a few times. I thought it was nice in the summer. A few more mosquitoes than I particularly prefer, but it was nice. But boy, in the winter, because I'd spent some time, I was actually born in the Chicago area, and I spent some time as an adult in Chicago, about a year. And boy, Chicago's pretty cold, but compared to Minnesota is just, I can remember sitting in my car one day and hearing on the radio that it was 35 degrees below zero, and thinking, hopefully my car, is going to warm up fast, because I'm outside a hotel and I've already turned in my key. I'm not sure I could get in the door. I might freeze to death before I walked around the hotel. Oh, that's a cold place. The car did warm up fast enough, okay, just in case anybody was wondering.
Whenever anybody talks about how cold it is in the Midwest, I remember how deep the ice was in the Ice Age over Minnesota, 2 miles thick.
Oh, really?
It wasn't a small glacier. The Laurentide Glacier was huge.
Giant Carson would say, I did not know that.
Yeah, it's just an amazing thing. And it meant the world was very different 13,000 years ago. But I should also mention that the world is still changing, and we still have an amazing menace, not just from our police and our government, but from overseas. And on Thursday, you had quite a take on the Chinese problem.
Yes, it's it's kind of hard. There's so many things going on with China, and I've mentioned in previous podcasts how for basically the last year, since the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square and the massacre, and that happened largely outside the square, and my trip to Taiwan and to Hong Kong and so on, I've picked up on China and what a threat it is. And of course, I've lived my entire adult life, and maybe even before I quite got to my adult life, realizing that the United States government was way out of control, and in my view, the biggest threat to me and to the rest of the world, in large part because I viewed Russia and China during my youth, correctly, I think, as not that much of a threat to the folks around them. I don't want to say, oh, they were peaceful, wonderful people. They weren't. They were just maybe bumbling tyrants. And so they just didn't have the ability to project power, as much as the U.S. did. And of course, I grew up during Vietnam and things that certainly focused me on the power my government had to control my life and to do things in the world, and then to combine those two. And so anyway, but I came to the conclusion that the Communist Party in China, the CCP, is a more dangerous threat to me and to the world as a whole than the United States government and to any other government. 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people that live under a high-tech totalitarianism, no free speech, no elections, one-party state where 25 Politburo folks, and really Xi Jinping, runs the world for 1.4 billion people. And they are wed to that idea. They're pushing that idea. But as they have begun to clamp down in Hong Kong with the coronavirus, basically kind of freeing them up to do that and delaying the protests that had run for, better than half a year. And of course, those protests, you hear so much different media stuff. These protests are over, to just give a quick history. Britain, with some gunboat diplomacy, took Hong Kong. They ran it as their little, province. They turned it back over to Hong Kong or to China in 1997 with a 50-year agreement that it would be an autonomous place that, had some autonomy. Now, the CCP, their leader, when you hear about Carrie Lam and the fact that everybody in Hong Kong hates Carrie Lam, who is the chief executive of the Hong Kong government, you might also want to know that Carrie Lam was picked by Beijing, not by the voters of Hong Kong. And so Beijing is controlling so much of what's going on. Well, this latest national security law, which, does some things like you can't boo the national anthem at a soccer game or anywhere else. Can't do anything that's seditious. So if it's too anti-Chinese, that's somehow sedition. Foreign influence, there can be no foreign influence. So if you talk to any foreigner, you might be arrested. It is basically full-fledged tyranny coming directly from Beijing into Hong Kong. And where is it being passed? Well, it's being passed in China. It's not being passed in Hong Kong. It's being passed in China and implemented in Hong Kong. And of course, some of the separations about not having like a police presence and a headquarters in Hong Kong that operates as a governmental body, that's changing. So it's not as if this is a surprise, but it's interesting to me that they can't wait. They can't wait 27 more years when they could do this somewhat lawfully. Of course, you can't enslave people lawfully. That's a BS law. And so, you can't do that. But in essence, they could say, well, now this is our agreement. We're not violating at least our agreement with the British. So this National Security Act has, they've tried different aspects of this for years. And there's been protests every single time. And there are protests now, but you just see the clampdown coming. And I think in part because China realizes maybe the gig is up. There is a scene in Casablanca, the great movie made during World War II. Humphrey Bogart is in his Rick's Place Cafe in Casablanca, and he's drinking because the woman he loves has just walked back into his life, and it's all a mess and so on. And so has a fugitive, and the Nazis are there, and it's all the things that make life wonderful. So he says to the piano player, "Hey," his buddy, "what time is it in America?" Which, of course, is a ridiculous thing to say because America has many time zones. But anyway, what time is it in America? His watch has stopped. And then says, "I'll bet they're asleep all over America." And, of course, they are probably because it's, but on the other side of the world almost. And I keep thinking of that. I keep thinking of that moment in that film because I feel like in the same way after Tiananmen Square, we were somewhat asleep. We were somewhat, we'd become very hopeful that, China's on the brink of kind of a full-fledged democracy where, it just would be a beautiful thing. It's a huge number of people in this world. And then that is scuttled and people are murdered and we're back to one-party state. And with wealth has not come freedom. It's come a much wealthier threat. And it's part of what our commentary, went through is all the different things that have happened just since the coronavirus was spread around the world as the Chinese were arresting doctors who were trying to warn about it and covering it up. So that's what happens. And then during April and May, in a piece in the Atlantic, Tim McLaughlin writes and talks about how a Vietnamese boat was sunk in the South China Sea, how China is claiming islands that have been claimed by Vietnam, how Malaysia, an oil rig, was basically just surrounded by Chinese vessels, and then Australian and U.S. naval forces came in. I regularly keep up with what's happening in the Taiwan Strait, the 100-mile wide part of the Pacific between Taiwan and China. And I don't remember in years past ever hearing anything, ever, about ships going through there or whatever. Well, U.S. ships are going through there all the time now. And maybe they have been for years, but part of it is that China is running all kinds of war games and different things, invading Taiwanese airspace with their jets and doing doing different things to threaten Taiwan, and has said recently, that they feel perfectly justified in invading and taking over Taiwan. And, we could go through the whole historical thing, which we have before in one of these podcasts, I believe. But even without all that, what's obvious in Hong Kong, what's obvious in Taiwan, these are people with freedom who want to keep it. The elections in Hong Kong, this last December, 87% of the candidates who won were pro-democracy candidates, new candidates in a pro-democracy effort that didn't exist before. That's the kind of support, 87%. It's the kind of support that the pro-democracy forces in Hong Kong had. In Taiwan, they've had some economic problems, just slowdowns and stuff. Part of it because Beijing is trying to, mess around with a very pro-Taiwanese regime. President Tsai Ing-wen has been very good in terms of China has to respect us, and we're going to do what we're going to do. And so it's interesting to see the world start to wake up. It was interesting to see that President Tsai in Taiwan came out and said that they were going to reevaluate, because of this national security law, whether they were going to keep their relations with Hong Kong, their trade relations. And of course, it was a precursor. I thought it was smart that she got out early, because Pompeo announced to the Congress that he was not going to certify that Hong Kong was an autonomous region. Well, it's not autonomous. It's just obvious as can be. But I'll tell you what, in past administrations, I have to at least wonder if they wouldn't be finding some way to supposedly put diplomatic pressure on the Chinese, but to certify that, yes, well, we're going to say it's still autonomous, so to not upset any of the trade stuff going on. And of course, there's different ways to deal with trade. We could go into a long thing, but from just the standpoint of actually showing up and saying, hey, no, we're not going to go along with you taking over Hong Kong and us turning, looking the other way. The Trump administration has come to the table. There's a number of things happening now. Japan is actually paying the cost to move, to pay for their companies. I don't think I'd be willing to subsidize our American companies in this way, but it's interesting. Japan is paying the cost, the government, the taxpayers, to move companies back to Japan from China. The federal pension system was looking to start investing in Chinese companies. And the Trump administration came up and said, no, we're not going to allow that. And so there's all kinds of things like this happening. And I have a hopeful view, even though things look very dire in Hong Kong. And I think we have to keep, we're not out of the woods in terms of this menace, but we have at least, I think, begun around the world. People have begun to see what this is. And friends of mine that I communicate with in that part of the world, I point out that, I don't necessarily, as good as the Trump administration has been on China, and I think it is a noticeable improvement over past administrations, I don't trust the Trump administration. I don't trust the Republicans. I mean, they've been better, and I applaud that, at least on these issues regarding China, although Democrats have not been terrible on some of these issues. For the most part, it seems to me that in the White House, we have wanted, and people paying attention to the whole issue of China have mainly been people who want to make money in China. Well, they're not looking to cause some problem and to, hold up the flag for human rights so that their company gets deep six. The whole reason they're at the party is because they're trying to make money in China. What's happened is that the public has showed up. What's happened with this virus, what's happened with the Uyghurs has finally gotten out to the rest of the world. And then that's just the tip of the iceberg. You find all the other things that have gone on during the CCP's reign in China. So the public, the nice thing is we don't necessarily have to trust Trump as much, or Biden, should he be elected, as much, because both of them are going to be somewhat constrained by public opinion that sees China as a tremendous threat, as a menace to their own people and to the rest of the world. and that changes the dynamic, and thank goodness. And that's why, not that we haven't done most of it, but for whatever small part we have played in these podcasts and at thisiscommonsense.org in highlighting what's going on with the Communist Party in China and what's happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan and other places in the world, Australia, where they're at loggerheads in terms of economic issues because China has so much different hooks in that country, in academia and in business, that there's a real battle going on. And then, of course, before we close this one, I also threw in, I had read something a couple of weeks ago about a little skirmish on the border of India and China. And I got a little kick out of it. I have to confess, and I apologize, but I got a little kick out of it because I thought, well, this is kind of a silly story that, somebody marched the wrong way down some road in the Himalayas, and or I don't even know if that far is still the Himalayas, probably is. Anyway, they're on some road and they got on the wrong countryside, and so it was all probably a big misunderstanding. Well, it turns out it's not a big misunderstanding, that India is trying to develop some of that area, that China doesn't want them to develop that area. And anyway, there was another story that came out just yesterday, the day after we did the piece Disgraced and Rage Belligerent about China. And it appears that more forces have been moved into that area. And so if you look at it, you just see the situation where, beyond concentration camps and Hong Kong, and India now is having trouble with China. This is just there's a lot to say grace over.
Yeah, the problem I see is that all this pulling back out of trade agreements, trade restrictions, this is often a prelude to war. And China itself, the Chinese government, the junta or whatever you want to call it, they're under pressure. I mean, they're not. It's not a stable situation, and that can be really bad. I don't know what to say about it.
It is hard to know. We know that in 1989 there were major protests, and that protests that started at the universities quickly spread. And there are polls and different people who tell you that the Chinese government's hugely popular. I just have to say, and I don't have evidence, I'm just telling you what my nose tells me, they are hugely unpopular. You don't become popular by, being a totalitarian. And so I do think that there's, you could see some revolution in China. You could see all kinds of change happen within China. And ultimately, militarily, there's no way for the U.S. or anybody to protect Hong Kong militarily from China. That's not going to happen. It's difficult enough. Thank goodness that the Taiwan Strait is a difficult waterway to launch an amphibious landing on Taiwan. But it's difficult to defend Taiwan. Ultimately, and China's big enough that if it wants to go to war different places, it can. Ultimately, though, even if you protect all the surrounding area, the rest of the world, 1.3, 1.4 billion people in China, they cannot live under complete tyranny forever. And so it's one of those things where this has to change. So hopefully it will not be war. I think, it's hard to know because we don't have we only have the time that we have since World War II. It does seem like in a nuclear age, major powers have been less likely to go to war with one another. And even the kind of proxy battles tend to be lower scale, not allowed to get to a bigger scale. But that's true until it's not true.
Yeah, that's
so it's a very dangerous world. I know from a libertarian standpoint, I've always considered myself a non-interventionist, and I still consider myself a non-interventionist. But I am not. I want the people of Taiwan and South Korea and Japan to be free, just like I want the people of Alabama and Missouri and California to be free. And so I do think that it's useful. Like, I don't think there's anything that says you cannot have military alliances. I would think, though, that we would want alliances that are agreed to by the public in some democratic way. And you could say, well, the Congress could pass a treaty. Well, if we had a representative Congress, that would be true. We don't. So there's all kinds of problems there. Okay. But however we do it, I do think it makes sense to have agreements with free countries that can stand on their own 2 feet, like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea. And I would think that I would not want to have alliances with countries that did not defend the freedom of their own people. What would be the point? In that way, of course, the idea would be the American people, what is our goal around the world? Well, it seems to me our goal around the world is to be able to do business. And most of us aren't going to do business around the world. And it's not like, oh, we love multinational corporations. We just so want you guys to do business. But I do want them to do business. I do want those products. I do want somebody shipping stuff from the other side of the world. So we want to do business. We want to be free to travel and see this beautiful world. And it seems to me that we have an interest in maximizing that freedom for everyone. And this becomes a problematic suggestion because you could easily say, well, this is just an entangling alliance that's going to get us drawn into some war. But I would argue from our current standpoint, where we are policing the world, is how we have to begin. How, from that standpoint, do we look at the globe and say, where are we going to continue and where are we not going to continue things? And I guess what I would argue is we want to look to end being an empire. We want to release from any commitments where we are defending a tyrannical regime. And I realize, look, people are going to have different definitions of what tyrannical means. But I would want a government that seriously, just like the recent decision about Hong Kong, didn't look at some region that just had its autonomy completely stripped away and pretend that it had autonomy anyway. And of course, we do that all the time. I mean, we have certified, I believe, a zillion times that Egypt is a free and wonderful democratic country and stuff so that we can continue to fund their military. So I recognize that the government can lie about these things, but I do think that that's where the American people are generally, that's what they want out of foreign policy, is a world that's easy to navigate as a tourist and as a businessman, and for free people to be defended from tyranny. And it'd be interesting to see that presented to the American people. Like, I've always thought one of the neat things about running for president is you're going to talk about the world some. And less so, it seems like, in recent elections, even though we haven't reduced our footprint around the world, but we talk about it less and talk more about our own, economy. But I think it would be interesting to take that to the American people. Because as we've talked on this podcast a lot, we need the public to be engaged in the political process at home and across the board. We need to leverage free people living somewhere else. If anything happens to us, you're our hope. It reminds me of Winston Churchill in World War II saying that even if they took England, the empire would still be there. And I don't like the idea of an empire, But I think a lot of that empire, in other words, if something happens one place, there's support for free people other places. And we want that sort of world. We don't want to retract. We don't want to say, no, we can't have an agreement. There's nothing about freedom that says you can't make an agreement with another free person or free corporation or free, soccer club or free country. And so the idea, it seems to me, is we ought to be coming back to a more sensible foreign policy, less of an empire, but with those sorts of goals in mind, that we want to do it in such a way that maintains the freedom of navigation and the ability of people to have a free world to trade and to meet each other and have dinner with each other in.
Well, that certainly seems to lead into Tuesday's piece, the pandemic turning point, because Americans are getting a little tired of lockdowns, and it seems that they want freedom to move about and trade.
I got a tremendous amount of feedback on this particular script, and especially on that map that we showed. And we should put the map up so people can see it. You see this huge area of almost the entire country in green, and then you see tiny areas of yellow, New Orleans, Chicago area, I think, East Coast, especially New York area, DC kind of up, and a little bit on California. And then you see red at New York City. And it basically makes the point that the number of deaths from COVID-19 in the green area, which is literally the entire country, are equal to the number of deaths in the yellow areas, which are tiny, which are equal to the number of deaths in the red area, which is basically just New York City and very close in surrounding area. And it's, you begin to realize part of I think the initial reaction to it was the fact that where media is, New York, DC, were hotspots, especially New York, where a lot of media is. And so it was a big deal. And of course it is a big deal. But it was a more immediate deal about overwhelming everything, which of course it ended up not. We weren't overwhelmed for ventilators or beds or anything else, as we've talked about many times. But the other thing was, that didn't mean that in upstate New York, it was a devastating situation. And there's so many places, in Arkansas, which is where I grew up, they never did shut down. The governor never issued a stay-at-home order that was universal throughout the state. And basically, a lot of businesses closed. And this is what we've said a number of times. But let people make their own decisions. Freedom is not only the right thing and nice, it's also the smart thing to do, because who knows whether this business can operate safely. Let people make their own judgments who are actually at that business. Not at some Capitol, some room off the press operation in the Capitol or the governor's mansion, who's, 200 miles away and just thinking about how to protect their fanny from being accused of getting somebody killed. And of course, that's the other thing, is let the people who are on it's their business that's going to go under. And it might go under because they opened it and someone got something and they were sued, or it might go under because they don't open it. Let them make that decision, when otherwise the decision is going to be made on, the longer I hold out, the less anyone can accuse me of getting anybody killed. Trust me, no person, no politician wants to be accused in TV ads, 30-second, 15-second spots, that they got a bunch of people killed. And so it has created just a very weird situation, it seems to me. The other thing we point out in Pandemic Turning Point is the idea that lives are lost in shutdowns. and that and it's the old, wasn't it Bastiat who was the seen and the unseen? And so you do a minimum wage and you hike it up to $15, and the guy who's still working at the restaurant as a busboy is now making $15, and boy, he sees that. But the guy the boss said, look, we're just don't have enough hours anymore to keep you on, who lost his job, he doesn't realize it was the $15 minimum wage. And in the same way, I think we have a situation where when you shut down an economy, you create a cascade of events that are going to result in deprivation and death. We pointed out one simple way is the fact that people were not doing operations that they needed because the operations weren't deemed emergencies, because they didn't have to happen or they would die today. Well, you go 3 or 4 weeks, and maybe they didn't know quite how long the heart was going to hold out or how quickly that artery would be blocked. And so it does get blocked. You have a heart attack. You weren't where somebody could get to the hospital. You die. And so there are all these different scenarios in which a shutdown can get a lot of people killed. None of those are counted against the fact that people are dying. And of course, a lot of people, we're hearing stories all the time about 96-year-olds who get COVID-19 and live. But there are also 96-year-olds who get COVID-19 and die. And, I think in some years, maybe they would be a flu death if they had the flu. But a lot of these are people who are in very compromised positions. And so I'm not saying their life matters any less. It doesn't. But I'm saying, as far as public policy goes, we ought not say their life counts more than the life over here that will be lost because somehow we can identify them more easily. So that's, I do think it's going to be very interesting because the media is so on the side of shut down forever, and the death game and so on. And yet I think the public is going to turn against, it's already starting to turn against these shutdowns. Now, the polls, I believe, all show that people are still scared to open up and so on. But all of this, I think, is likely to roll in such a way that come Election Day in November, the lockdowns do not seem to have been a very good policy.
Well, I'm certainly agree with you on that one. It looks also like that by tracking people on their iPhones and things like that, using that tracking, much of the travel element of the lockdowns is over. People have basically determined that they're going to do what they want to do. So it's really only a question of the businesses and the churches and so forth that have been shut down, and that's the only real issue here because the people themselves are not in lockdown anymore. They're ready to go. Yes.
The other thing that we mentioned in that commentary that I think was interesting, I was glad to include it because to me it meant something early on in this. Remember all the gnashing of teeth because of the people in spring break, the young people partying and so on. And it has come out that not a single COVID-19 case has been traced to spring break in Florida. And part of it is, being outdoors, this is not an outdoor disease. It's not being spread outdoors. And I suspect that if there were cases that were spread, they were asymptomatic, which is going to be more likely among younger people anyway. So it's, we sometimes get a little bit too quick on the oh my goodness, somebody did something that I wouldn't have done, therefore they're the worst people in the world. And it turns out that the evil spring break partiers didn't hurt anybody other than themselves, maybe, if they imbibed too much.
Well, that's 4 out of 5 common sense commentaries for the week.
And we sort of recycled a common sense, which we've done from time to time. Memorial Day holiday, I wanted to bring up something that we did last Memorial Day because I think it is, I've done a lot of stuff about the draft. And, issue near and dear to my heart, and something that we have to decide whether to expand registration to women, young women, or better just end it for everybody. So that's an issue that's coming up. But the issue of military service, and, well, I'll just mention what happened. Last year, right around July 4th, or right around Memorial Day, the U.S. Army on its Twitter feed asked people, how has serving impacted you? How has your service in the Army impacted you? And, the obvious, idea is, I learned to be a man or whatever, some wonderful thing happened. I met people, I gained increasing knowledge. The discipline that I was fostered in me led me to be a successful businessman, whatever wonderful story there would be. And there were some positive stories. But what there was also about 500 times as much of were rants, and not unsophisticated or unintelligible rants, but very intelligible rants about being screwed over, about leaving limbs on the battlefield and then not being taken care of once you get home. Everything from being defrauded in the sense of told one thing to get in the door and then not given that field of work in the Army, to giving your all and parts of your body and watching friends give their all and then coming home and not getting any help or treatment for your injuries. And we this is a country where we're constantly here. Thank you for your service to military people. We are the number one superpower. Hurrah, hurrah! Throughout the world, the military is respected. I don't think there isn't 1% of the population that would be against spending a little more money to make sure veterans who came back without a leg or who came back shell-shocked, PTSD. But they wouldn't want that to happen, whether on the right, the left. We all want that to happen. And yet, going back all the way, I don't know what it was like before I was born, but I know from Vietnam all the way to the present, the VA has just been pitiful. And again, I know it's not that the VA, all the good people went to work somewhere else and all the bad people went to work at the VA. I guarantee you, under the right management, you take all the people that are at the VA today and they could run a good system, or they could run the problem is there's not the political push to do it. And again, that tells you we're not being represented. We want it to happen universally, almost universally. We want veterans to be taken care of. They're not taken care of. Why is that? It's a complete governmental breakdown, and it's happened for decades. The other thing is, we want to thank people for their service, but wait a second, don't we also need to consider that we've gotten involved in all kinds of things that have cost thousands of people's lives? We're going to stay in Afghanistan. How many people do you, Mr. and Mrs. America, how many people are okay to die in Afghanistan for what we're accomplishing there? What's your view? Are we accomplishing enough that there should be another death, another, maybe another 100 or 1,000 Americans who die over there? And that's what we don't get at all on Memorial Day. It's easy for everyone to virtue signal that they said thank you, but that's not our job. Is not as like the hospitality staff for the Pentagon. Our job as citizens to decide what this country's going to do and whether either our kids or somebody else's kids are going to be, and I'm an old fogey, so I can say kids, but whether they're going to be killed, whether they're going to come back without a leg. And so anyway, it's every Memorial Day. I wouldn't mind rerunning this piece. It's one less piece I have to come up with, but no, seriously, because it's just not talked about much. We hear about the VA, but it's almost like, that's government. Well, it's us. If we want to somehow, it just seems to me that to walk around saying thank you for your service, like somehow we're all part of this big gang together, and then not to take any frigging responsibility for the fact that they, are decimated physically and sometimes mentally and are given no care, or then to have no dog in the fight about whether we go have some fight that gets a bunch of more people killed. This, the problem isn't saying thank you for your service. The problem is in not holding our government accountable. There are ways to do it. Come to thisiscommonsense.org. You'll see some things that are happening. You'll see links to other things. There are ways to get involved. You can also go to libertyifund.org, where the Liberty Initiative Fund is actively working with people around the country. And you can go to citizensinchargefoundation.org or citizensincharge.org and get involved in helping initiatives and referendums. One of the new ideas I have for initiatives around the country is to take on this qualified immunity. We don't have to wait for the Supreme Court to take a case. Now, maybe they'll do it for us, but maybe not. Why wait? I'd love to see that on the ballot. That could be on the ballot somewhere in 2020 if people move fast. And it'd be great to see someplace. It would take some education of people as to what it was, but it might send a good message. It'd be interesting to see if it could still make the ballot in Minneapolis.
Well, that's interesting. And it is about accountability. People forget it's not a question of, it's not really even out there. It's a basic American idea. It's part of liberty. It's just really basic.
Yes. And it seems to me that it doesn't mean there isn't things happening about race, but it's just, here's something that we don't have to control what's in somebody's head. We can control what's written down in a law book, and we know it will dramatically change. And one reason people will know that it will dramatically change the way courts deal with some of these things is because we'll get a heck of a lot of fight from the police unions and the prosecutors who want this, unlawful shield. That's what they call it, because it shields anything they do. And I do not fear that somehow, police are going to be walking on eggshells because if they look at somebody the wrong way, they're brought up on charges. We see how far it's gone the other way, to where somebody, for no reasons, a policeman can fire 7 times into somebody, right, point blank range. Or this guy, where we've just seen so many cases where it just makes no sense. And it doesn't mean, the goal isn't to, the goal is to have accountability, exactly as you said and the piece said, because it's like with police cameras. Sometimes they help the policeman, sometimes they don't help so much, because the policeman either did the right thing or he didn't do the right thing. I think the public tends to give the policeman the benefit of the doubt anyway, and for the law to so put its big thumb on the scale for the policeman, it has just created a situation in which we see the film of people like Tamir Rice, I think was 12 and in the Cleveland area being gunned down. We see it and we just think this can't be. And yet the policeman, no charges, off scot-free. So we've got to do something about that. And we can. That's the good news.
So, what did we learn this week? Well, I learned that I could be wrong. There was more than one happy, hopeful piece written by Paul Jacob on thisiscommonsense.org this week. I also kind of misstated the Ice Age business. The ice sheet, the Laurentide ice sheet was thick in some places, not so thick in others. And Minnesota had lakes over it, huge lakes, vast lakes during the period, here and there. There's the Duluth Lake, I think, and there's the Lake Agassiz. So, if you want to learn about Ice Age geology, you probably don't turn to me. And you say don't turn here, you come here for politics from an individualist, libertarian, conservative, citizens in charge kind of perspective. And that's what we got here at thisiscommonsense.org and This Week in Common Sense, which you can find through several podcatchers and at SoundCloud. This Week in Common Sense. And my name is Timothy Verkala. I make mistakes all the time. But you can catch me at locofoco.net and at workman.com. That's Workman with an I, not an O. And we'll chat later. Thank you.